what the hell is gender complementarianism. Dan, why don't you kick us off? I mean, just broadly, how would you define that idea?
It's a great question. Complementarianism is almost a theological. I think it's appropriate to describe it as a theological stance on gender roles, right? So one thing that religion is very good at doing is telling people what to do. And like, this is another kind of aspect of that, right? So like, I would think like there's how the church would describe it, those who believe in it, and then those who are outside of it. So I think the church would describe it as, well, it's a way of, talking about God's intentions for men and women. And he does have separate intentions for men and women, according to them. Specifically, men tend to gravitate towards leadership roles, women gravitating towards, support roles. And of course, men and women being defined as they traditionally have, in that fundamentalist sense. And so like there is these prescriptive interpretations of particular biblical verses, most notably some in First Timothy and some other places that will talk about like, oh, these are men and women's roles. And like, this is how they're supposed to be in order to like function optimally, not just like in society, but also like in the eyes of God. So like, that's how they would define complementarianism. How I would define complementarianism though, Christy, is just the church telling you how to live your fucking life because of what you got in between your legs. Like that's really how they see it, I think. And I don't like it. I've never liked it, even when I was a Christian.
Yeah.
We'll probably talk about this later, but I do want to talk about my story with the book Wild at Heart, which is a very, very popular book on gender complementarianism.
You know what? I'm remembering how we came to this episode. I believe there were some beers involved and a discussion about that book between you and I, because Jesus, if that book isn't a well, it's a problem. It's a problem.
Well, it's not only does it exist as a book, it also now exists as a podcast, and it exists as an ongoing like theological seminary show or something that travels the churches. It's a media empire. It really is. Yeah.
Jeez. Well, yeah, Nate, anything that you might add there, or maybe about the theology and kind of the biblical underpinnings of these ideas? I mean, I don't know what your relationship with scripture was growing up, but this doesn't feel all that divorced from the quote God of the Bible.
No, it's absolutely intertwined with the God of the Bible and theology. And for me, what this just boils down to is men with power trying to keep it and possibly trying to get out of helping with the dishes, basically, is what it comes down to. I mean, that's sort of a little microcosm of the greater issue, but it's basically white men with power who basically want to keep it and don't really, they want to keep the women in the kitchen. They don't want to have to help with that. It's just men being lazy and awful.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem with it, because it's often describing very modern ideas about how men and women should be functioning. Like they pretend like they're looking at these ancient texts and revealing some sort of ancient wisdom from there. But the truth is, like, if you look at ancient, Jewish societies, and societies, I have to say plural because across the diaspora, it's going to be different, based on the customs, but also like just ancient cultures in general when it comes to treatments between men and women. And it's going to be different. Like it always has been different. And even in this book and in other places where people talk about this, like it's not consistent. There is an organization called the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood that created a statement. They actually created two statements, a more recent one called the Nashville Statement in 2017, to try to actually like write out specific wording and boundaries on what they mean when they talk about this stuff. And there's churches and other organizations that have kind of signed this document. But like churches will do this. Like they'll have like basically statements on theology that they will sign to signal whether they agree or disagree on this. So there's like some attempts at rigidly defining this, but really, I mean, it's kind of up to, like Nate said, whoever's in charge. Like, yeah, we want to keep that
whatever
power.
feels convenient.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I suppose asking who believes this horse shit might be a little bit too simple, but it sounds like it's tied to a lot of evangelicalism, a lot of patriarchy. I mean, where do these types of things show up?
Well, let's see. According to the Wikipedia page, we got the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Presbyterian Church of America, the Evangelical Free Church of America, and a list of like a couple dozen other churches and organizations here. So it's a lot of Christianity,
All
particularly.
signed on to that specific credo.
Well, they're not necessarily signed on to that specific credo, just
Okay.
that there's written citations of broadly defined
Endorsing those ideas.
complementarianism, endorsing these ideas in one way or another. Yeah, because again, it's inconsistent on what exactly these things means. I mean, churches today can't even figure out whether women can be pastors, right? Like that debate is still happening with a lot of people, and like that disagreement, why they can't figure it out, is because they're going to the Bible to look at these ideas of how gender roles are supposed to be performed. I don't think personally, now I've read the Bible, Nate and Christy, I don't know if you guys have. I don't think it's a very good guide on how people should live their life, let alone what they have to say about human biology and, you know, human roles within society. But you know, that's just me. That's just my opinion. So,
and let's not just single out the Jesus thing either. Muslims are pretty bad at it too. I have a fella come over from a Muslim country that's recently started working with him, and I literally had to show him how to use a broom. And I asked him to clean up, and he's like, "I don't do that. That's women's work." I'm like, "No, yes, you do. You do now." And I had to show him how a broom works. I'm like, "How is the function of this thing not evident to you?" It's crazy.
Yeah. And it goes back to Judaism. I mean, like, there's literally rules on if you're menstruating at a camp, like you can't be like in the camp for several days. You know, like these kinds of rules and specific peculiarities where the law actually doesn't affect men and women equally come from, you know, Judaic texts, which is interesting to see, and obviously not unique to Judaism either. I mean, most cultures are not great towards women. I mean, but European ones, maybe. I mean, I don't know. Other places, actually, in more agrarian societies, there's a lot of talk around in anthropologist circles about how there tends to be more equality within the work between sexes and stuff, which is interesting to see. It seems that as we've developed more of these kind of rigid hierarchies that we tend to find, again, in like European societies, this is where we also find large amounts of sexism, which, hey, who knew? Who knew, guys? This is like, whoa, come on. Crazy.
Who would have thought that the male-dominated culture that steamrolled every indigenous population they came across maybe had some shitty ideas? What an earth-shattering revelation.
It's obviously the liberals that are really ruining this, right? I mean, they're the ones to blame, I think. So
yeah, well, and I think that's
terrible.
As much as you're poking fun, I think that's a important part of this conversation, because so much of the context of why we're hearing about this and why it's become such a rallying cry, I mean, it's very much like a straight pride kind of energy, because there is a lot of pushback against traditional gender roles right now. I mean, we don't want to have a society, I'm broadly speaking, I think, we don't want to have a society that needs to have a Me Too movement every 5 years just to keep caught up with all of the accusations, with all of the sins that need to be atoned for. But as much as I'm hearing you like list off these different organizations and these different cultures spanning back time, in modern day life, how widespread do you think these assumptions are?
Well, I think as a general rule, the more fundamentalist your Christianity, the more likely you are to believe in gender roles, right? So again, I'm just talking about from a Christian perspective, because that is the culture in which I grew up around. It certainly was prevalent in the places where I was at in Central Texas. I think, you know, last stats I saw, about a third of the country still believes in like young earth creationism in some form. And I'm willing to bet that those same people also believe, like broadly speaking, that there's these differences in men and women that are perhaps God ordained. So it's a lot of people, at least in the US, for sure. Right. It's weird how tied together these seemingly I mean, like very different ideas are when it comes to looking at the theology of the Bible and what Jesus supposedly taught and what Paul totally taught, and actually how far they will go with some of these prescriptions, because we really are talking about, again, like very different ideas as to how ancient societies and cultures form themselves versus today. Like they literally are just mad whenever a woman like becomes a boss, or like a woman has anything to do with like the decisions that men have to make
Becomes
on
a
certain
bother.
matters.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's in
yeah.
the way.
Yeah, like there's not a lot of dudes that are like, oh no, we're fighting to like get into the roles that women have, right? Because like women have not had power in our society for most of its existence. So, and even today, right? So it's very interesting to see people defend these kinds of ideologies, because you really are kind of defending the power. Now, that's not to say, by the way, that women don't endorse these ideas, right? Like
Right.
there's a lot of people who exist in the church today who are saying, no, these are good. I feel more comfortable in this role that has been prescribed to me. And I guess that's fine if you like it for yourself, but it's one thing to like it for yourself and to say, no, you also have to follow this rule, right? So
Yeah, no, I mean, when we first started this show, Megan had a almost weekly segment where she would just read things from Jamie Lawson, the transformed wife, and
right.
then get angry about it. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of oppression here coming from all directions.
I believe the term is internalized misogyny, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Mhm.
Let's be fancy
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Well,
So go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that honestly, we have spent enough time on this show, like clearly debunking all of these ideas. I don't know how much time we really need to spend on that project, because obviously non-binary people exist. Obviously, having a particular phenotype or chromosome pair or genitalia does not define you in every aspect or put restrictions on like what's appropriate for you. And yet, as our understanding of like the science of gender, the biological underpinnings of these things gets more sophisticated, I feel like these voices are getting louder.
Yes.
Yeah, why is it so tempting?
It's tricky to say. I don't know. Again, like we obviously talked about a very obvious reason to me, which is power,
Sure.
right? So like in our society, in American society, like we have these ideas about men and women and what they should be doing, and like men have always in this country been the politicians for the most part. They have always been the bosses of companies, the leaders, quote unquote, right? And that's kind of been the role that has been filled in this space. And in order to keep that up, there has to be some sort of justification for it beyond like biology, right? If biology doesn't become the grounds by which you can base these things off of, then you have to instead go to theology, right? So like obviously there's a lot of people who misunderstand biology, so they're still going to be using those kinds of biological arguments, but you can have a perfect understanding between the differences between men and women, or lack thereof, from a scientific point of view, and still say, well, this is what God said, though. Like this is how things are supposed to be, and you can kind of point to that, and the language becomes less about what science has to say nowadays and more about spiritual things. So to give an example of this, I want to point this out. This is a statement made by a Baptist organization, the Southern Baptist Convention. Basically, again, these organizations, they just love making these big statements that they can kind of sign on to and say, well, we agree and disagree to this. So I'm going to read this to you just to give you an idea of what they think about complementarianism, specifically in marriage. Okay, so here's the quote. The husband and wife are of equal worth before God, since both are created in God's image. The marriage relationship models the way God relates to his people. A husband is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. He has the God-given responsibility to provide for, to protect, and to lead his family. A wife is to submit herself graciously to the servant relationship of her husband, even as the church willingly submits to the headship of Christ. She, being in the image of God, as is her husband, and thus equal to him, has the God-given responsibility to respect her husband and to serve as his helper in managing the household and nurturing the next generation. In other words, it's separate but equal. Like that's really what they're trying to say. right? Like they really want to emphasize, no, like no, they are equal in this partnership. They're just, they're ontologically different, but they're functionally ontologically the same because they both come from God, but functionally different, right? And that's the caveat here. That's why people will defend this, because they will say, and even I thought this as growing up as a Christian, like, oh, well, this is still a fair system. We're still both equally loved by God. We just have different roles that we're just better at. And if we
different responsibilities, the fact that our responsibility is important and your responsibility is not, let's not get worked up on the details.
Well, they won't even say that. They'll say it's equally important, Christy. They're both equally important, right? One just happens to, dictate how you're going to live your life, and the other one is just how you choose to live. And so it's very I don't know. I don't want to say sinister, because I don't know if it's actively malicious. I think a lot of people believe this stuff subconsciously, but it is very sad because people who do believe this are obviously limiting themselves and how they can live their lives. And I do think that's sad.
I mean, honestly, in a completely non-joking way, when you were reading off that quote, there's some real discomfort. Like anybody listening who felt a little bit triggered by that, I just want to validate that experience, because I know I spent a lot of time on a hard wooden pew hearing that kind of bullshit day in and day out. You get away from it, you almost forget how, I don't know, the cadence of it is just very specific in a really disgusting way.
Yeah, it gets in your head. That's for sure.
Yeah. And it doesn't help that, like, when we live in a society that seems to validate these ideas, because you look at it and say, like, wow, look at all these men who have been in leadership positions, and look at all these women that have played domestic roles. There must be some truth to it, because look, it's already happened. You can point to the history of it and not realize, oh, well, they're dealing with their own socialized ideas of what they think is right and wrong. And there's also an equal lack of opportunity between both sexes historically. I mean, we're talking about a country that only decided 100 years ago, I guess women should vote, like,
Well, and I think it's important to remember that the argument around that was often that the head of the household would vote on her behalf, right? Like be represented in that way, which, Jesus, like that's so easy to normalize, and yet so incredibly ridiculous and offensive if you look at it for half a second with clear eyes.
Yeah. And another thing that I should point out that should be obvious, but like this is obviously a very easy recipe to set up for domestic violence and for abuse to occur, right? Because when you have relationships like this, you can justify people's action or inaction to do certain things as, well, this is the man in the house, and we got to listen to them, and that's just the way things are. And like, how many times has that been cited as a defense for people hitting other people, for people saying abuse to other people? Like it's too often too much to list, right?
Yeah, and that's without wanting to make overly much the experience of just day in and day out being constantly reminded that you're less than, that you're less significant or less important.
Yeah, absolutely.